saved? Wait, is this one of those end-of-the-world things?
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating theological study that looks at a pretty unique phenomenon. Why does the absolute most important question in the universe often cause the most confusion? Seriously, think about this everyday scenario. You walk up to a neighbor, a coworker, maybe a family member, and you ask them, "Are you saved?" Now, for you, asking that question, those three little words carry the heavy, heavy weight of eternity. It's all about rescue, love, and a real sense of urgency, right? But the study points out that for the person on the receiving end, especially if they don't have a church background, that question usually just produces confusion. Maybe they're mildly offended or they just quickly change the subject. They hear the word saved and instantly think of immediate physical danger, a massive crisis. But sitting there at the office water cooler, they don't feel like they're in any danger at all. They feel perfectly fine. So today we're going to explore how the source text attempts to bridge that massive gap in understanding.
To do that, the source gives us a roadmap to reframe this whole thing from what often feels like a confrontational argument into a patient, empathetic diagnostic process. We're going to cover the evangelism disconnect, sin as a disease, the three hidden witnesses, the simple gospel antidote, and finally, planting the seed. Let's dive right in. So, right off the bat, the text notes we have to acknowledge the awkward reality here. It is awkward to ask someone if they're saved when they don't feel endangered in the slightest. The core confusion isn't that the listener lacks theological sophistication. It's just the simple absence of a felt threat. It's literally like throwing a life preserver to someone who's sitting comfortably on a park bench reading a book. When a secular person hears the word saved, their immediate internal reaction is, saved from what exactly? I mean, they aren't drowning, they aren't trapped in a burning building, they aren't visibly sick. The concept of salvation is totally, completely inseparable from the concept of a danger that requires a rescue. If they haven't identified the danger, well, the proposed cure sounds completely irrelevant to their everyday life.
Which brings us to Section 1, the evangelism disconnect. Let's look at why people miss this felt threat.
To understand why this disconnect happens, the study explores how modern culture effectively masks our human vulnerabilities. Asking a healthy, happy person if they need a spiritual life preserver creates an immediate barrier. Young, vibrant people are so deeply insulated by modern metrics of success. Think about it: a high follower count, a growing bank account, hitting career milestones, endless entertainment. It makes the concept of an internal crisis practically invisible. The author actually suggests there's probably no conversation more challenging than talking to a young adult in the absolute peak of their health and social popularity. They just aren't thinking about mortality or divine judgment. They don't feel the weight of a spiritual deficit because they're way too busy, too connected, and too entertained to even notice it. The applause of the crowd acts like this thick, comfortable anesthesia against any sense of eternal urgency.
To counter this insulation, the text points to a sudden, pretty jarring reality check from the Gospel of Luke. This captures the biblical parable of the rich fool. Here's a man who had such an abundant harvest, he decided to literally tear down his barns to build bigger ones, just to store all his wealth. He told his soul to take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry for years to come. But God's response was immediate and striking. "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee." Your soul is required tonight. The study also draws a parallel to the Old Testament story of Nabal, another wealthy, dismissive guy who thought he had plenty of time to feast and live for himself, only to be struck down suddenly. The point is, the assumption that there's always tomorrow is a profound spiritual blind spot. People feel certain they have decades left, until, with terrible finality, they discover they don't.
And that leads us to Section 2, sin as a disease, where we start looking at this concept as a terminal diagnosis.
So, to bridge that gap in understanding, the study suggests a complete reframing of our religious vocabulary. It advocates moving away from the cultural baggage of moral finger-wagging and instead looking at the absolute physical reality of the human condition. The crucial pivot? Redefining sin. Instead of viewing it just as committing some monstrous crime, the framework defines sin as an active, inherited disease that is already at work within the human body. See, most people assume sin means doing something terrible, like murder, so they instantly exclude themselves. But the text references Romans 5:12, explaining that this condition entered the human race at a specific moment in history through one man, and physical death came right along with it. It's not just a penalty for the wicked, it's the universal inheritance of the entire human race.
The body is already aging, cells are deteriorating. Presenting sin as a terminal disease with a 100% mortality rate gives the listener a very concrete, highly personal reality to grapple with.
The author then draws a really fascinating contrast between our deteriorating physical state and the eternal reality of the soul. According to the text, establishing this dichotomy is the foundation. Looking back at the Genesis narrative, it notes that while the physical body was formed from the temporary dust of the ground, the soul came from the direct breath of God. The theological framework here posits that when a person dies, the body returns to dust, but the soul returns to God who gave it. The soul doesn't just cease to exist when the heart stops beating. Because the soul outlives the physical body, it's going to face a divine judgment based on the seeds planted during its physical life. And the text observes that the undeniable proof of this physical deterioration is literally all around us. Every massive hospital complex ever built, every funeral we attend, every obituary in the morning paper, even every new ache that announces the arrival of middle age, it's all a physical reminder that our bodies are not permanent. The author notes that the most confident, beautiful, or powerful person in the room is, in biblical terminology, just a flower that will eventually wilt. So the study poses this rhetorical question. When a messenger asks, "Are you saved?" they are essentially asking, "Do you know the flower is wilting? And do you know what happens to the immortal soul after it does?"
Moving on to Section 3, the 3 hidden witnesses. This is all about how God is actually already working in the background.
A major point the study makes about this diagnostic process is that a messenger is never actually starting from zero. The framework asserts that God has already been working in the background way before a conversation even begins. The text outlines 3 continuous witnesses already installed inside the listener. First up is the witness of creation, based on Romans 1. The argument is that the universe isn't silent. The sheer biological complexity of life and the order of the cosmos serve as this thundering declaration of a creator. Second is the witness of conscience, from Romans 2. The study posits that a moral law is written on every human heart across all cultures, constantly accusing or excusing their actions. And third is the witness of the Holy Spirit, which, according to John 16, is actively working to reprove the world of sin. So you aren't creating awareness out of thin air. You're simply surfacing what these internal witnesses have already been signaling all along.
The text suggests that the conscience acts as an incredibly powerful internal ally in these conversations. It points to this verse in Romans 7 to describe the exhausting, universal gap between who a person intends to be and who they actually are. Everyone, no matter their cultural or religious background, knows exactly what it feels like to fall short of their own personal standards. We routinely do things we despise, and we routinely fail to do the things we value most. The author suggests that asking a simple, non-threatening question like, "Have you ever done something you knew was wrong and couldn't stop thinking about it?" taps directly into this internal witness. It's a relatable way to help someone identify the reality of a flawed nature in their own lived experience.
To further validate a person's search for meaning, the study references the historical account of King Solomon. It uses Solomon to show that even the absolute pinnacle of earthly success is ultimately empty without an eternal foundation. Solomon had more wealth, exotic imports, massive architectural achievements, and fame than any modern influencer could ever dream of. Kings and queens traveled across the known world just to hear his wisdom. Yet the text points out that at the end of his life, looking at all his massive achievements, Solomon called it all vanity and vexation of spirit. He had literally everything the world had to offer, looked at the whole shebang, and essentially called it wind. The study uses this to powerfully illustrate that a life built purely on human approval and temporary metrics simply cannot endure the test of time.
This brings us to Section 4, the simple gospel antidote. Let's talk about presenting the permanent cure. Once that framework of the spiritual disease and the immortal soul is set up, the text moves to the cure. And it breaks down the gospel of Christ into profound yet beautifully simple historical facts. First, Christ died. This is the ultimate substitution for the disease of sin. He took the place of the afflicted. Second, he was buried. This represents the complete destruction of the disease, signaling that the debt was paid in full. Third, he rose again. The study frames the resurrection as the undeniable proof of being cured from the disease. And finally, belief. That is the simple action required by the individual to receive the gift. The study highlights a truly incredible biblical promise here. Believing in the gospel of Christ guarantees a brand new body.
While our current flesh is just decaying dust, this theological promise guarantees a new body that is incorruptible, glorious, powerful, spiritual, heavenly, and immortal. It's a total upgrade.
The author anchors this cure in this passage from 1 Corinthians, demonstrating the absolute foundation of the Christian message. The text makes a crucial distinction here. This wasn't just some inspiring martyrdom where a good teacher died for a noble cause. No, it was a literal substitution where Jesus took the penalty for the guilty. The study emphasizes that the burial sealed the payment in the cold certainty of the tomb, leaving absolutely no doubt of physical death. And the resurrection 3 days later, that proved the payment was accepted by the Father. The text portrays the gospel as astonishingly simple because it relies entirely on the completion of these historical actions by Christ, rather than the ongoing, exhausting efforts of the individual.
This shift represents crossing permanently from death to life. The study argues that at the exact moment of genuine belief, the soul crosses over as a past tense completed action. The text strongly emphasizes that this isn't framed as a probability. It's not some conditional promise based on your future performance. It is a permanent shift. The disease of sin is forgiven at its root, and the soul is entirely safe. According to the source, it's simply the act of receiving a gift extended by a generous hand, with zero ongoing maintenance demanded to keep it. This complete cancellation of condemnation is presented as the ultimate antidote.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, planting the seed. We really need to shift our expectations about evangelism itself.
The study notes that a huge source of burnout in religious communities actually comes from skewed expectations regarding evangelism. It argues that a messenger's job isn't to force a harvest or to single-handedly save anyone. The text shifts the expectation entirely. A messenger is only responsible for speaking faithfully and lovingly. It posits that it's the Spirit's responsibility to convict and regenerate. The author uses this great agricultural timeline metaphor to explain this. On day 1, you might plant a conceptual seed in a casual conversation. In year 3, a completely different person might come along and water that seed through another interaction. And perhaps in year 10, God provides the increase. The study emphasizes that trusting this timeline removes that overwhelming, heavy pressure to see immediate results.
The source emphasizes that whether an audience mocks the message, hesitates, or believes immediately, the pressure is completely off you. The text references the historical account of the Apostle Paul in Athens to illustrate this. When Paul stood at the Areopagus on Mars Hill and presented these concepts to the Epicureans and Stoic philosophers, he actually got 3 totally different reactions to the exact same faithful message. Some mocked him outright. Some said, we'll think about it and hear you again later. And some believed immediately. The study points out that a conversation that seems to end with a polite shrug is not a failure. A seed was planted that might germinate months or even years later, when that individual faces a personal crisis, and those internal witnesses bring your words right back to the surface.
The author references the book of Ezekiel to underline the mechanics of how this message actually spreads. It uses the analogy of a watchman on a city wall who is held accountable for simply sounding the alarm when danger approaches. The text suggests that while God does the saving, he absolutely relies on willing human messengers to patiently build the soil and ask those diagnostic questions. It notes that staying silent just to avoid a little social awkwardness carries immense weight in this theological framework. Drawing a contrast with the story of Jonah and Nineveh, the study highlights that God doesn't require strategic genius. He doesn't need a perfectly crafted philosophical argument. The text implies he just requires a willing voice, a faithful word, and a messenger who trusts the ultimate outcome to a higher power.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought. Knowing this detailed theological framework, this diagnosis of a universal disease and the historical cure, who is the person in your life that requires this gentle diagnostic conversation? The study suggests that society is filled with people who are completely anesthetized by their own temporary lives, totally unaware of the spiritual concepts at work inside them. But by using the methodology outlined in this text, you can bypass the religious jargon, appeal directly to an individual's conscience, and point them to the permanent cure. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it completely transforms the way you view the source material's take on the most important question in the universe. So who will you plant a seed with today?